Hello, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, whenever you may be watching this. Welcome to another episode of Reasons to Believe. My name is Matthew Petrusek, and I'm an associate professor of theology at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. It's a great blessing to be with you again today. So last week we talked about a pretty heavy subject, and that was the difference between the culture of life and the culture of death. And putting those two things together brings out some hard truths, especially some truths that can be very difficult to say, especially in public today. But if there's one thing that the church is a witness to, it's a witness to the truth. And so one of my favorite lines, and this in fact is one of the motivating scriptural basis of the show, is that we need to speak the truth in season and out of season, whether it's convenient or inconvenient, lines from St. Paul. So in that spirit, we're going to continue to talk about some difficult truths today, looking at the question of social justice. So I've entitled our discussion today, and again, please put your comments, please put your questions. I'm happy to answer them. We need to get clarity on this, so I very much invite you to be a part of this in the second half of the show. The reason I've entitled it Reclaiming Social Justice is because social justice is one of those terms that nowadays has immense moral potency to it. When you say social justice, there's a sense in which you're supposed to be believing something, even if it's not exactly clear what it is. And part of the problem, and this is an issue that I've touched on in just about every episode here, is that there's great ambiguity about what it means, and that ambiguity can be manipulated and weaponized to use the concept in a way that actually goes contrary to church teachings and in fact contrary to reason and contrary to justice itself. So today's lecture we're going to be getting more clarity on what social justice, not only what it does mean in a contemporary context, but also what it should mean. And I want to start off by saying that social justice is one of the gifts of the Catholic Church to the world. Social justice is at the heart of what it means to act according to Christ's mandates in the world. So it's not a question of whether the church is for social justice or against social justice. Well, the church is for it. The church, this is a somewhat strong claim, but I think it can be defended. The church invented it. So we want to start off by recognizing that social justice, yes, is at the heart of our faith and at the relationship between faith and reason, but we need clarity on what it means. So that points to the first diagram here today. I've got a special treat for you. I'm going to be flipping the board today, so this is going to be an action-packed episode. What I was practicing before the show, I actually hit myself on the head while doing it, so hopefully that will not be repeated, but I'm willing to do. I'm willing to sacrifice for you. So I will be flipping the board after we go through this diagram. So the first point that I want to clarify is the question of diversity and inclusion. Diversity and inclusion are attached to social justice almost like hand in glove. Anytime we talk about social justice, you almost immediately hear either before it or after diversity and inclusion. And so the question is, well, what do those concepts mean and what could they possibly have in relationship to social justice? For any of you who have adults who have college students, or if any college students are in fact watching, I'm sure you've heard diversity and inclusion in an academic context as well. So at the superficial level, diversity and inclusion simply means difference. So diversity is pointing to there being differences in the world, and more particularly differences among human beings. And inclusion means bringing those differences into one unified body. So I've depicted that here as diversity meaning a collection of different individuals, each one of them having different kinds of characteristics. And inclusion would be the formulation of a body of some kind, and then the goal of bringing those who are outside into the group. So on the surface, they're really quite sort of obviously morally banal characteristics. Like if you say, is there a problem that there's diversity in the world? Well, of course it's not a problem that there's diversity in the world. Each one of us is a unique individual. Is there a problem with inclusion as a concept? Well, of course not. I mean, think back to middle school and what it felt like. I mean, this didn't happen to me. I'm just using an example. To be the last one picked when you're playing dodgeball. Right? No one likes to not feel included, I've been told. Okay, so on the surface, there's nothing wrong with these concepts. The problem is we need greater specificity, especially when they're being used in a socio-political moral context, by which I mean they're becoming these like political principles and rallying cries. Here we need to begin to be careful how we're defining them. Because when we're talking about diversity and inclusion, we're ultimately talking about making discriminating judgments. Let me say that again. Discriminating judgments. We're talking about making choices. Now, choices themselves, making judgments themselves, requires saying yes to something and no to other things. It's sort of for those of you who have any background in the study of logic, because of the principle of non-contradiction and the principle of identity, if you're going to say yes to this, that necessarily implies no to another thing. So we're always making discriminatory judgments understood as saying yes to this and no to this. So it's not a question of whether we make discriminating judgments or not. It's a question of what? Are those judgments unjust or are they just? So it's a question of justice, not about making judgments, but justice. So let me give you obvious examples of unjust discriminatory judgments as they relate to diversity and inclusion. So, for example, it used to be illegal in this country and widely across the world for women to vote. So women were excluded from the community of citizens who had the right to vote. Well, that was an unjust discriminatory judgment. And on the basis of justice, there is a good argument, an argument that fortunately reached its conclusion in an amendment, to change that so that this body, specifically defined as citizens with the right to vote, includes all women. Another category of unjust discrimination, of course, is racism, right? It's totally irrational and therefore always categorically totally wrong to make a judgment on someone based upon their physical appearance, including how that relates to race. So that's categorically always unjust. And if anybody is ever excluded from a community, however that community is specifically being defined, because of that characteristic, that is unjust. Full stop, period. Okay. However, there's also just forms of discrimination understood in this very particular way, meaning excluding certain groups of divisions of humanity from inclusion in a community. What do I have in mind here? How about giving 10-year-olds a driver's license? All right? We could say there is a community of drivers that we will call the group, and within that community there's lots of different kinds of drivers, but you know what kind of drivers are not in that group? 10-year-olds. So we could say, therefore, because 10-year-olds are not in that group, that must be some kind of injustice involved there. And so therefore justice, social justice, calls us to invite all 10-year-olds to become full members of the driving community. Like, you see the problem here, right? Well, no, that's a just form of discrimination, understood as not including into a particular group. So we could look at other examples, and I will in just a moment, but that's the point here. Again, the point is not diversity and inclusion. The point is it just or unjust? So what might be some other just forms of exclusion? Well, let me first say that in order to have a group of any kind, especially as that group's going to be related to values and beliefs, which I'll get to in a moment, you have to have an identity. And if you have an identity, well, then that makes that group a particular thing, which means it's not another thing. So by definition, groups are exclusionary in that particular sense. So then we revert back to the question of whether it's just or unjust. So let me give you some examples. So let's say a basketball team. We could say basketball teams are a community, and it would obviously be unjust to exclude people because of their race. But is it unjust to exclude people because of their skill? Like, would it be just for me to walk into the NBA, I guess they're all holed up, we're in Orlando right now, and say, look, I don't feel welcome in your community. And I, at 5'8", and 220 pounds, would like to be a part of your community, and I feel discriminated because I'm not a part of it. Well, you see the problem there, right? But no, you don't have the skills or even the capacity to develop the skills to be a part of this community. But it could get even more absurd than that. What if you have a basketball community and say it's just a pickup league, okay? It's just a pickup league, and someone comes up to them and says, look, you're playing basketball, that looks like fun, and I'd like to join your group. And they say, sure, yeah, I think we can make space for one more. And you say, well, I would like to play baseball in your group. And you can imagine, right? The players would look at each other and be like, well, this is a basketball group. Say, yes, but I don't feel included in your group because I want to play baseball, and I want to play baseball in your basketball group. And then the response would be what? But this is a basketball group. So then what's the point? It's not unjust exclusion to prevent or not allow individuals into groups if there's different purposes for those groups, okay? So this looks at capacities and talents, maybe, and we'd have to get into the weeds here to really start really fleshing this out, but maybe just grounds for exclusion. The purpose of the group may be just grounds for exclusion. And here's the main point I want to get to before we transition into talking about more specifically about social justice in terms of comparing the Catholic Church version of it to the secular version, is it also includes values and beliefs. So if we have a group, for example, think of a pro-life group that is dedicating to saving the lives of all unborn children. Okay. So someone could go up to that group and say, I want to be a part of that group. And the pro-life movement, as I know, is very welcoming, right? They have a very high interest in including as many people as possible because it's ultimately tied to the movement for life, okay? As we talked about last time in the culture of life. But then someone comes along and says, yeah, but in your meetings, I want to have time to speak about why abortion up to the 9th month and even after is true, right, and good. So I demand that you give me time at your meetings to speak about why abortion is good. Now, would it be unjust for the pro-life movement to say, we're a pro-life movement, which means we reject the moral validity of abortion, and so no, we're not going to allow you to speak those views in this group, or to hold those views publicly and openly, and to advance those views in this group? You see, that's the problem. That's the problem, is that once diversity and inclusion becomes a license or a warrant for some people to force groups to accept them, and they're confusing unjust and just discrimination, well then ultimately groups can lose their identity. And how this is tied to social justice is that we can say, and I hear this very frequently in fact, that, well, the church should find common cause with all people who are for social justice. And that's true on the surface. Of course it's true on the surface. But once we start getting down into the principles, and we say, well, does that include people who may, for example, maybe they agree on some principles of immigration, or maybe they agree on some economic policies that appear to be helping the poor, but they also are calling for abortion up until the 9-month and after. Well, they should be included in the church. And then the question is well, really, is that a just form of inclusion or an unjust form of inclusion? And does that actually ultimately dissolve the identity of the group itself? So we have to be careful that the language of diversity and inclusion is not used as a club by those who are actually inimical to the church's values, both at the natural law level and at the supernatural level in terms of living according to the full truth of Christ, to allow people who are actually seeking to undermine those values into the church so that they can undermine them from the inside while being given a welcome as they do it. Justice has nothing to do with that. So again, clarity on these issues is absolutely crucial so they're not used to work against the culture of life. Now the grand reveal, we switch to the other side. Look at that. No head hitting this time. Okay. So with our remaining time together in the discussion of reclaiming social justice, I'd like to make a comparison, as I've been doing in all these other lectures, between the secular conception of justice and the Catholic conception of social justice. And I want to emphasize here again that when I'm talking about secularity, I'm talking about it in a postmodern context. Now remember, the heart of postmodernism, and again, it's internally complex, but the heart of postmodernism takes the form of recognizing that there's no such thing as an objective truth. There's no such thing as a universal good, that ultimately either communities come up with their own definitions of the good, but they're just limited to those communities, or individuals come up with their own definition of the good, but we can't speak about truth in any universal or objective sense. That's in we find that in the anthem of secularity, you do you and I do me. Or you have your truth and I have my truth. So again, that's the particular context that I'm looking at here for secularity. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare the secular vision of social justice with the Catholic vision of social justice along these categories. So let me explain the categories first, and then we'll begin the comparison. The first is, what's the purpose or final goal of social justice in secularism and in Catholicism? So ultimately, one way to think about it is if this vision of the view won, or if it were to become the dominant view, not in a domineering sense, but it were to become the view, it were allowed to unfold according to the own internal workings of its own principles, what would it accomplish? What does it want to do ultimately? That's the purpose or final goal. The next category is its conception of moral knowledge. And what I mean by that is how does it understand how we come to know and identify what good and bad and right and wrong are? What are our resources? What do we point to say, this is where I get my answer to the question, what is right, what is wrong? That's its conception of moral knowledge. The next category is its anthropology. And that's just a fancy word for saying, what view of human nature does it presuppose, does it have in mind? How does it understand what the human being is individually, and how does it understand what the human being is in community? We'll see how all these can look very different depending on the context that they're in. The next is its mode of implementation, meaning what is the means by which secularism on the one hand and Catholicism on the other hand seeks to implement its vision of social justice? What tools does it use? What's the paths that it takes to try to realize the vision that it has respectively of social justice? And finally, what is its vision of perfection? So what is its final understanding of what the perfect society would look like? And here, I want to be careful here, we're talking about the perfect society in space and time. Because again, when we're talking about a postmodern context with the secularism, one of the inherent claims within that is that for secularism, there's no reference to God. There's no reference to the transcendent. Okay. So the purpose and final goal of secularism is ultimately power. It's ultimately the acquisition of power by one group or one constellation of groups over and against another group. Now you may say, well, that's a very uncharitable read of it, but there's a philosophical reason for that. Within the secular universe, remember, there's no transcendent God. And so if there's no God, there's therefore nothing that ultimately unites all reality. And if there's nothing that ultimately unites all reality, then ultimately different people have different conceptions of the good, and the only way to sort that all out is through a fight of one way or another, because there's no one standard that all people can point to and say, that's actually what's truly good, and we should all seek to conform to that. So if there's not one standard, then you just have a big mishmash of different groups fighting it out. And so the goal of social justice will ultimately be power. Which group or constellation of groups can amass the most power? In contradistinction to that, we have the common good in Catholicism. Now note here, the common good is not the utilitarian, the greatest good for the greatest number. Those are two radically different things. The common good is the basic idea that if all people live according to what is truly just, at the individual level and at the social level, There'll be no winners and losers. There will only be winners because all things will be put in their proper order. The individual will be rightly ordered to the state will be rightly ordered to the individual to the family, families to each other, and ultimately all things in relationship to God. Common good, we have to remember, has its final transcendent point located in the divine. So it's not about power for the Catholic view. It's ultimately about the right ordering of things so that all beings flourish. Individuals and societies flourish. There's no inherent competition there. Okay. Conception of moral knowledge. The conception of moral knowledge, how the secular conception of social justice finds what's true, and I put true in big fat scare quotes there because it doesn't really believe in truth, is an appeal to emotion or feeling. Now, emotions and feelings aren't bad in and of themselves, but the question is what do they look like completely absent from reason, or if reason is only used in service of emotions and feelings. So the basic sort of primal orientation that secularism has to the world is, what does this make me feel? Does this make me feel good, or does this make me feel bad? Do I feel sorrow? Do I feel pity for what I'm seeing, or do I feel some sort of pleasure? Now remember here, reason is not a factor. So reason can't help sort out whether the feeling that I'm experiencing right now actually corresponds with reality or not. So all we're left with is feelings. On the other hand, with the Catholic conception of social justice, again, we're not discounting the importance of reason and feeling, of feeling and emotion at all. But the primary mode by which we acquire moral knowledge is through reason, and that includes all forms of reason. That includes logic, so looking at sort of the very structure of how the mind works and what must be true if one thing is true, what that implies and what it presupposes. Metaphysics, thinking about the structure of reality and how all pieces fit together. And it also includes empiricism, and that just means it includes experience. It includes looking at the facts. It includes what actually happened, not what's my immediate reaction to something that I'm seeing, but what is true. And this is especially important in a context now, right, where we have these viral videos that create these visceral reactions right away. If you're here in this land, that's all you have is your visceral reaction to act on. Right? All you have is your feelings. Here in the Catholic world, you may have a visceral reaction, but then you put it up and against in the light of reason to examine, am I actually perceiving things as they truly are? And that's a central point here, is that living in the Catholic conception of social justice, the goal is to conform to reality itself, reality ultimately understood as God and how God has ordered the world. So it's always reality-based, always seeking to return us or get us to what is actually the case. Okay, anthropology. The secular conception of anthropology, this sounds a little fancy, but I like it. I think you're going to like it too. It's Manichaean communalism. Manichaean communalism. What do I mean by that? Well, for any of you who've studied a little bit of theology and maybe a little bit of St. Augustine, the Manichaeans were a group who were very influential in the early life of Christianity, and in fact were one of the groups, one of the sort of the groups that Christianity and had to argue against. In this thought of St. Augustine, we see a lot of this. Manichaeans believe that there's basically two fundamental divisions to reality. There's good and there's evil, and they're co-equal in a sense. They both exist, and either you live in the side of the good or you live in the side of the evil. So you can sort of split up everything in reality according to the good and the bad. So what I mean by Manichaean communalism is that the social justice movement from a secular perspective sees either you're in the group of the good guys, or you're in the bad group. And how that typically, the specific form that takes nowadays is either you're an oppressor or you are oppressed. So either you're bad, oppressor, or you're good, oppressed, and there's no nuance within that, or no intermingling of the two categories. So you're either of darkness or you're of light. Okay. The anthropology of the Catholic view recognizes, of course, there's evil in the world, but here's a huge difference. Evil exists within every single human being. We are all sinners, and so we're not going to cut off some slice of humanity and say, these are the good people and the rest of the bad, okay? Now, we can look at actions, we can look at behavior, but here I'm talking about in terms of the actual constitution of people. Everybody is a sinner. That's the doctrine of original sin. However, all of us are also all potentially saints. So there is the potential for evil in one of us, and that potential is always realized one way or another, but there's also the potential for greatness. So what does that mean ultimately? Ultimately, Catholics focus on individuals in terms of morally evaluating them. We don't focus on groups, right? So you focus on an individual and his or her own actions, while you can also take into account the sort of the social factors at play as well. Okay, moving on. Mode of implementation. So how do they realize their respective views of the good? The mode of implementation of the secular view is to divide and conquer. There's really no other way. Again, we're talking about the basic structure beneath it, okay? So if there's no one true good for all of humanity, and we're all at war with each other, then the only way to win is to get people on your side and fight against others, is to amass the most numbers. So you divide and conquer, zero-sum game. If there's winners, there must be losers as well. And if you're a loser, too bad. Either get in line or go elsewhere. Okay. The mode for Catholic thought is rational consensus, meaning the goal is to find actual agreement about what is truly good. And that's not saying it's easy to do that. It's saying it's possible to do that. So theoretically speaking, there doesn't have to be winners and losers. Finally, the vision of perfection. Ultimately, for the secular viewer, it's totalitarian in nature, meaning it wants total control. Two excellent books that explore what this can look like is the book by Aldous Huxley, Brave New World, and 1984 by George Orwell. Right? Or you could just look at history and look at the Soviet Union as well. So the goal is just the total absorption of the individual into the group. The vision of perfection, on the other hand, for Catholic thought is what's called asymptotic. What that means is that Catholics believe that we can move closer to true goodness in time and space, so it's possible to move closer, but we never believe we can actually cross that line. Why? Because we're finite and because we're sinners and because we rely on the grace of God. So no Catholic's going to come along and say, we can form a utopian society. Why? Because we know that any society that we ultimately form will continue to have sin on it. And so that actually puts a limit. It puts a bulwark against any government or any social movement claiming you belong to us and we require complete fidelity to you. And this is one of the reasons why the Catholic Church has always been detested by totalitarian governments, which is the case even especially in this day. So, how do we sum all this up? You say, well, who cares ultimately? Again, we're making these rational distinctions. And the answer is because if we don't recognize the differences here and we don't fight for one side or the other, this side wins. And it's not like a hypothetical thing. Well, it might win, it could win. Historically, it wins. And so we need the clarity, we need the courage, and ultimately we need that fidelity to the truth as we reclaim social justice. Thank you.